The night Cecily Hartwell played the piano at Ashmore House, she believed no one was listening. She had slipped into the east drawing room to quiet a child, not to be heard, and the piece she chose was the one her father had taught her in the years before the deaths. Before the coughing. Before the cold mornings when she would come downstairs and find him already gone. It was a simple Clementi sonatina, the kind a girl of 8 might learn, and she played it with her eyes half closed and her spine very straight, because that was how her father had sat, and because the child needed something to follow. She did not hear the door. She did not hear the footfall on the Aubusson carpet, or the particular quality of stillness that entered the room with the Duke of Ashmore. Standing at the threshold with one hand resting against the frame, and his face arranged in an expression she would not have known how to read even if she had turned around. She did not turn around. What she could not have known was that he stood there for the full duration of the piece, and that when it ended and she lifted her hands from the keys, and the child sighed and went quietly still in the chair beside the instrument, he stepped back into the corridor without a word, because whatever had moved in his chest just then was not something he intended to allow in the presence of witnesses. That was the night everything shifted, though Cecily would not understand it for some weeks. She had come to Ashmore House 3 months earlier, in October, when the last of the solicitor's letters made clear that her position in London was exactly as precarious as she had feared. Her father, Mr. Silas Hartwell of Berkshire, had died in August, leaving 2 unsettled accounts with merchants in Reading, a small mortgage on the leasehold in Kensington, and a debt of £3,000 owed to Mr. Gerald Fenton, who was both a solicitor and the uncle of Miss Priscilla Fenton, which was a coincidence the world of the Regency season made absolutely inevitable. There was no dowry. There was no entail that favored her. There was a small watercolor of her mother in an oval frame, a pearl brooch her father had given her on her 20th birthday, and the kind of genteel education that had prepared her for a world that no longer existed. She was 23 years old. She was quiet. She was, in the assessment of nearly everyone who had met her at the 2 assemblies she had attended since her father's death, unremarkable. Lady Fenton had offered her a position as companion before the leaves were down. It was presented as generosity, and Cecily received it as such, because she understood that the alternative was to depend on a distant cousin in Shropshire who had written a sympathetic letter and mentioned, twice, that the house was rather full. She packed the watercolor and the brooch. She accepted Lady Fenton's carriage. The first time she heard herself described as the girl with nothing to her name, she was standing behind Lady Fenton in the receiving line at the Ashmore Winter Ball, and Lady Dorothea Vane, Dowager Duchess of Ashmore, was speaking in a carrying undertone to Mrs. Beaumont, who was standing near enough that the words arrived clearly and completely. "She is the Hartwell girl," Lady Dorothea said, her fan moving at a measured height, her diamonds catching the light from the chandelier above. £3,000 in debt, and not a penny beside. Lady Fenton collects them, I think, as other women collect porcelain. Mrs. Beaumont produced a sound that might have been sympathy and might have been agreement, and Cecily fixed her eyes on the candles in the wall sconces and breathed through her nose until the line moved forward. She was wearing a gown she had retrimmed herself, ivory silk that had been her mother's, the lace at the hem replaced with new ribbon because the original had gone thin, and she had no money for lace. It was neat. It was clean. It was, among the gowns assembled in the Ashmore ballroom that night, approximately as conspicuous as a plain white envelope on a table covered with gilded cards. The Duke of Ashmore she saw briefly at a distance, standing at the far end of the room near a window that looked out onto the garden. He was tall, and he held himself with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that other people move toward him, rather than the reverse. His face, in profile against the winter glass, was unreadable. He was said to be 32, recently out of mourning for the Duchess of Ashmore, who had died 18 months ago under circumstances that were referred to in drawing rooms as delicate, and that no one elaborated upon in the presence of a gentleman. He had not been seen in society for most of the preceding year. His return to the season was, by the calculus of the marriage market, an event of considerable significance, which was why Miss Priscilla Fenton was wearing diamonds that evening, and why Lady Dorothea's fan moved with such confident authority. Cecily was not there to be seen by him. She was there to carry Lady Fenton's wrap, and to remain proximate in case Lady Fenton's head began to ache, as it frequently did in warm rooms. She took a glass of ratafia from a passing footman, and stood near the wall and watched the season conduct its business, and thought, with the dry, private clarity she permitted herself only in the interior of her own head, that the whole arrangement resembled a livestock auction conducted in French. The piano was in the east drawing room, which was not the ballroom, and Cecily would not have gone near it had it not been for Henry. Henry was 6 years old, and was the youngest son of Lord and Lady Cartwright, who were guests of the house, and who had brought him despite the general opinion that children should not be brought to winter balls, because Henry had been unwell earlier in the week, and Lady Cartwright had not trusted the nursemaid. He was now hiding behind a chair in the east drawing-room, having been separated from his mother by the press of guests, and having, in the intervening 20 minutes, worked himself into the kind of silent, rigid terror that small children produce when they are too frightened to cry. Cecily found him when she slipped away from the ballroom to check the state of Lady Fenton's evening cloak. She knelt on the carpet beside him, which ruined the hem of her skirt, and spoke very quietly for a few minutes, until the white circle around his mouth began to ease. Then she sat at the piano, which was a fine instrument, a Broadwood grand, uncovered as though someone had intended to play it, and then thought better of the idea, and she played the Clementi Sonatina. And Henry stopped shaking, and the Duke of Ashmore came to the threshold of the room and stood there in the dark. She played it through twice. The second time, Henry's breathing had slowed and his eyes were closing. She let the last chord settle and folded her hands in her lap, and sat quietly until she heard his breath even out in the chair beside her. And then she rose and straightened her skirt, and went back to the ballroom to find Lady Fenton's cloak. And that was the end of it, as far as she knew. The Duke of Ashmore knew otherwise, and he had no language for what he knew. His name was Edmund, though no one in his daily life used it except his mother, and she used it as a category rather than a name, the way one might say the estate or the title to mean the same encompassing obligation. He had inherited at 24, on the sudden death of his father. He had married at 27, a woman he had believed he was capable of protecting, which had turned out to be the most costly assumption of his life. Catherine had died in February of the preceding year, along with the child, and Edmund had stood in the corridor outside her room and been told by the physician that there had been nothing to be done, and he had said thank you and closed the door of his study and not opened it again for 6 weeks. He had then returned to his responsibilities with the same calibrated discipline he applied to everything. And if the rooms of Ashmore House were rather emptier than they had been, and if her portrait in the upper gallery was turned to face the wall because he could not yet manage what looking at it produced in him, he considered this to be his own private accounting and no one else's concern. He had not intended to attend this season at all. His mother had managed that, with the same patient directional pressure she applied to every aspect of the Ashmore succession, and he had consented because arguing with Lady Dorothea on matters of social obligation was approximately as useful as arguing with the weather. He watched Miss Fenton across the ballroom on 2 separate evenings in November and found her exactly what she appeared to be: accomplished, polished, entirely certain of her welcome, and as remote from anything he actually felt as the landscape paintings in the South Corridor. His mother spoke of her at breakfast with careful frequency, and Edmund listened, and said almost nothing, and thought about the piano piece he had heard in the East drawing room, and the woman playing it with her eyes half closed and her spine very straight, who had not known he was there. He did not examine this too carefully. He was not, at this point, prepared to. The second ball of the season was at Fenton House, a fortnight after Ashmore's, and it was there that Cecily heard herself described a second time. She was in the supper room, standing a little apart from the table while Lady Fenton was served, when she heard her name in the voice of Lady Dorothea Vane, carrying through the curtained doorway with the practiced clarity of a woman who had spent 40 years calibrating the social weight of a sentence. "The Hartwell girl," Lady Dorothea was saying, to someone Cecily could not see, "has £3,000 against her, and not a single prospect. Gerald Fenton holds the note. I wonder that Lady Fenton keeps her, unless it is simply the economy of it." The response came in a lower voice, a man's voice, and Cecily heard the word unfortunate and the word companion. And then the curtain moved, and she was looking at the profile of Lord Cartwright, who had the grace to appear uncomfortable, and at the composed face of Lady Dorothea, who looked at Cecily with the pleasantly measured expression of a woman who has said nothing remotely unkind. Cecily looked back at her. She inclined her head. She said, "Lady Dorothea," and nothing else, and turned to bring Lady Fenton her plate. Her hands were steady. The steadiness cost her something, but she paid it without showing the price. What she did not see was the Duke of Ashmore, standing at the opposite end of the doorway, who had heard the same words and whose face had done something entirely unlike its usual arrangement for a period of perhaps 3 seconds before returning to its normal stillness. He had not moved to intervene. He had no authority to intervene. What he had instead was the particular specific quality of attention that he had brought, without intention, to everything connected with this woman since the evening in the East drawing room, and the knowledge, lodged somewhere below his discipline, that Lady Dorothea had aimed the description where it would cause the most damage. It did cause damage. He was not wrong about that. He was also not wrong, though he was only beginning to understand it, about the woman who had absorbed it, and then walked evenly across a supper room to bring her employer a plate. If you find yourself wanting to know what Edmund did with this information, stay close, because the answer took him another 3 weeks, and it was not painless. Gerald Fenton arrived at Lady Fenton's house on a Thursday morning in December, when the frost was thick on the windows, and Cecily was writing letters at the small desk in the corner of the morning room that had been designated as her workspace. He was a lean man of 50, with precise manners and the kind of measured warmth that cost him nothing because it was not warm at all. He sat down without being invited and placed his gloved hands on his knees and told Cecily that he had been reviewing the late Mr. Hartwell's accounts and that the £3,000 remained outstanding, and that he was in a position to offer a resolution. The resolution was this: Cecily would remove herself from Lady Fenton's household by the end of the month. She would do so quietly, citing her own wish for a change of situation, and she would not attend any further events of the season at which his niece was present. In exchange, Gerald would extend the repayment period on the debt by 12 months, at no additional interest. Cecily listened to this, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face in the expression she had perfected over the past 3 months, the one that showed nothing but civil attention. When he finished, she told him that she was grateful for his consideration, and that she was unable to accept his terms. He looked at her for a moment with a particular quality of stillness that suggested he had not expected this answer. Then he said that he hoped she would give the matter further thought, and gathered his gloves and left. She sat for a long time afterward, without writing anything. She was not naive about what she had just refused. 12 months was, in practical terms, the difference between having somewhere to sleep and not having it. She had no income beyond her position with Lady Fenton, and Lady Fenton's hospitality was contingent on the household finding her useful and unobtrusive, which meant remaining exactly where she was in the social machinery. What she had just told Gerald Fenton was that she valued that machinery less than she valued the truth of her own situation, which was that no arrangement purchased by her own disappearance was worth the price. She believed this. She had no idea what it would cost her. The answer came at Lady Dorothea's drawing-room gathering, 3 days before Christmas, which was assembled in the high-ceilinged front room of Ashmore House, with 30 of the most relevant people of the season, arranged on gilded chairs and settees, and the fire burning at the east end, and Miss Priscilla Fenton seated at Lady Dorothea's right hand, with the precise placement of an object that has been arranged to be noticed. Cecily was there because Lady Fenton was there, and because Lady Fenton had headaches and required proximity. She sat in the second row, beside Mrs. Waring, who was kind and interested in botany, and she listened to 3 musicians play 2 movements of a Haydn quartet and watched the room conduct its assessment of itself. The Duke of Ashmore was present. He sat at the far end of the room with the profile she had now seen often enough to recognize at any distance, and he did not look in her direction, or if he did, she did not catch it. She did not know, because she could not have known that he had spent the preceding morning with his solicitor, that Gerald Fenton had come to him directly after leaving her on Thursday, that what had been said in that meeting had removed from Edmund's chest something that had been sitting there since October, like a stone he could not account for. The stone had a name, which was the specific and conclusive knowledge that Gerald Fenton had used his financial leverage against a woman who owed him money to clear the field for his niece, and that the woman had refused him, and that he, Edmund, had not known how to protect her from something he had no formal authority to address. He knew now what to do with that. Lady Dorothea stood at the front of the room when the musicians had concluded, and with the ease of long practice, directed the gathering's attention toward the matter she had organized the event to address. She spoke of the coming months of the season. She spoke of the warmth she felt toward those present. She looked at her son with the particular maternal certainty of a woman who believed she had managed everything correctly, and she said that she was pleased to announce that the Duke of Ashmore would be partnering Miss Priscilla Fenton for the principal events of the remainder of the season, an arrangement that honored the families involved, and that she hoped would bring everyone present the satisfaction of seeing matters settled as they ought to be. The room accepted this with the sound that such rooms make, a ripple of approval, a murmur of pleasure, Mrs. Beaumont saying something that ended in charming, and Miss Fenton looking at her hands with the composed and practiced expression of a woman who has expected this and is prepared to receive it gracefully. Cecily felt the words arrive somewhere below her ribs and settle there, cold and quiet and complete. She had not expected anything. She had not permitted herself to expect anything. She had been paying very careful attention to the lesson the world kept attempting to teach her, which was that expectation was a luxury available to women with dowries, and she had £3,000 of debt and a retrimmed gown and a desk in the corner of a morning room, and she was not surprised. She was not surprised, and she was also something else, something she could not afford to examine in this room, in front of these people. She waited until Lady Dorothea had finished, and the gathering had shifted back into conversation. She waited until Lady Fenton was occupied with Mrs. Beaumont. She rose quietly, excused herself to Mrs. Waring, and walked through the door at the side of the room that opened into the passage toward the east drawing room, because she had decided, clearly and without drama, what she intended to do. She would play the Clementi Sonatina one final time. She would play it for herself, because this house had been, in some way she could not entirely account for, the only place in 3 months that had felt like something other than a waiting room, and she wanted to leave something of herself in it, even if no one knew she had done so. Then she would collect Lady Fenton's wrap and return to Bruton Street and write a letter to the cousin in Shropshire. The piano was uncovered, as it always seemed to be in this room. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys, and began. She was 4 bars into the first movement when she heard the door. She stopped. The Duke of Ashmore walked across the Aubusson carpet and came to stand beside the piano. Not at the threshold this time, but close enough that she could see the detail of his cravat and the particular quality of his expression, which was not cold, or at least was not only cold. There was something else in it, something she had no name for, which looked very much like a man who has been deciding something for a long time and has recently finished. He said, "Miss Hartwell." She said, "Your Grace," and made to rise, because the proper response to the Duke of Ashmore appearing beside the piano while one was playing it was certainly not to remain seated. He said, "Please do not stop." And then, after a pause, "I should have said that on the first occasion. I did not." She looked at him. He met her eyes and did not look away, which was a thing she had noticed about him across the preceding weeks, that he did not look away from things that were inconvenient to look at, even when looking away would have been easier. She said, "I did not know you were there the first occasion." He said, "I know." A particular silence followed this, the kind that is not empty, but full of the weight of everything that has not yet been said. There were voices in the passage outside, growing closer, Lady Dorothea's voice among them, and the higher sound of Miss Fenton's, and the solid confidence of Gerald Fenton, who had apparently decided to attend this gathering, despite not having been on the original list. Cecily folded her hands in her lap and prepared herself for whatever the next several minutes would require of her. Edmund turned toward the door as it opened. Lady Dorothea came through it with the particular forward momentum of a woman who has organized the world according to her specifications and expects to find it still arranged as she left it. Gerald Fenton was at her shoulder. Miss Fenton was a half-step behind, still wearing the composed expression from the drawing room, though it had become, in transit, slightly less composed. Lord Cartwright had followed, and Mrs. Beaumont, and 3 other members of the assembled gathering who had, for reasons of curiosity or instinct, come to find out what the Duke of Ashmore was doing in the east drawing room during his mother's announcement. Lady Dorothea took in the tableau with a single rapid assessment, the kind she had been performing for 40 years, and her fan stilled. She said, "Edmund, we were looking for you. The gathering is not yet concluded." Edmund said, "I know. I have something to say before it concludes." He said it without raising his voice. He said it with the particular level authority of a man whose rank and whose conviction had aligned behind a single purpose, and the room, which had arranged itself around the piano, and the woman sitting at it, heard something in his voice that produced a general and immediate stillness. He said, "Miss Hartwell came to Ashmore House this autumn as a companion, in circumstances made difficult by debts that were not of her making. During that time, she has been described in this house and in others as a woman with nothing to recommend her. She has been used as a category, not a person, by people who found the category convenient." He did not look at Gerald Fenton, but the room understood the reference. 3 days ago, she was offered relief from those debts in exchange for her disappearance from public life. She refused. I would like everyone present to understand what that refusal cost her and what it demonstrated about her character, because I have spent 3 months watching that character from a distance, and I am done with the distance. The room was very quiet. Miss Fenton's expression had completed its departure from composure. Gerald Fenton's had gone the color of chalk. Lady Dorothea stood with her fan at an uncertain height, which Cecily had never seen before, and which was, she would later think, the most accurate measure of the moment's weight. Edmund looked at Cecily. He said, "I would like very much, Miss Hartwell, if you would allow me to call on you formally. Not as a matter of season arrangements. Not as my mother's doing. As my own choice, made because there is no one in this room whose company I have valued more, and because I should have said so 3 weeks ago, and did not." The room did not move. Cecily looked at him for a moment with the careful attention she had always given to things she wanted to understand accurately. And then she said, "I think, Your Grace, that you were perhaps still deciding." Something crossed his face then, very briefly. There was almost an expression of warmth, or perhaps relief, or perhaps both at once. He said, "I was." She said, "Then I will accept." Mrs. Beaumont made a sound. Lord Cartwright cleared his throat in a way that served several purposes. Miss Fenton turned and walked to the door with her spine extremely straight, and Gerald Fenton, after a pause that contained a great deal of visible internal adjustment, followed her without speaking. Lady Dorothea stood for another moment, the fan still at its uncertain height, and then something passed across her face that was not quite recognition, but was close to it. The specific look of a woman who has organized a great many things and has encountered, for perhaps the first time, something that was not hers to organize. She said quietly, to no one in particular, "I see." That was all she said. She withdrew to the drawing room. The witnesses followed, because there was nothing more to witness, or because there was much more to witness, and they had the good manners to provide it privacy. Edmund remained beside the piano. Cecily remained at the bench. The fire at the east end of the room continued its work, and the sounds from the drawing room settled slowly into the normal register of a gathering resuming its business in the wake of something unexpected. Cecily said, "There is a matter of £3,000. He said, "Mr. Fenton's note has been purchased this morning by my solicitor. The debt is settled. The terms require nothing of you." She looked at him. "You were very certain I would agree." He said, "No. I was certain that whether you agreed or not, the debt had no right to determine your choices. I have resolved it accordingly. What you choose to do with your freedom is entirely your own affair." She thought about this. She thought about the letter she had been preparing to write to Shropshire. She thought about the desk in the corner of a morning room, and the receiving line, and the 3 separate occasions on which she had heard herself named and reduced in a single efficient phrase. She thought about a 6-year-old boy in a chair, breathing evenly, and the man who had stood in a doorway for the full duration of a Clementi sonatina, and then walked away because he was not yet ready to know what it meant. She said, "I did not expect this." He said, "I know. You have been very careful not to expect anything. That is, I think, the most costly thing the season has required of you. And I am sorry for my part in extending it." She did not have a ready answer for this, because it was accurate, and because accurate acknowledgment, offered without expectation of return, was not something she had encountered in recent memory, and her body received it before her composure could manage the gap. She placed her hands on the keys of the Broadwood Grand and played the opening bars of the Clementi Sonatina. Not as a farewell, this time. As something else. As the piece she had played in the dark for a frightened child returned now to the room where it began, in full light, and with a witness who was no longer in a doorway. He stayed beside the piano until it ended. They were married in January at a small ceremony in the village church, a mile from the Ashmore estate gates, in the presence of Lady Cartwright and her husband and Henry, who stood very solemnly in the pew and held a sprig of holly he had chosen himself. Lady Dorothea attended with a composure that had settled, over the preceding weeks, into something that was not quite approval and not quite acceptance, but something adjacent to both. Something that resembled the movement of a woman who has found herself at the edge of her own map and is choosing to be interested rather than afraid. She did not speak the word choice or the word freedom, but she brought a practical gift, a set of household account books bound in green leather, and presented it to Cecily in the hall after the ceremony, with a formality that contained, if one was paying attention, the smallest degree of real consideration. Cecily received it as the offering it was. The snow came properly in February, the kind that settles and stays, and the grounds of Ashmore House were white to the tree line and pale under a sky the color of pewter, and the fires in the house were all burning because Cecily had been slowly, room by room, learning which chimneys drew well and which required a particular arrangement of the damper. She was not yet fluent in the house, but she was learning it, the way one learns a piece of music, by returning to the same passages until they are no longer foreign. The upper gallery she had come to on a morning in late January, following the sound of a door she could not account for, and she had found it empty and high-ceilinged and cold, with the portraits of 4 generations of Vanes arranged along the north wall, and one frame near the window that faced the wall, its back toward the room. She had stood before it for a long moment. She had not touched it. She had, instead, told Edmund about it that evening, because she believed that he should be the one to decide, and because she had come to understand that his particular discipline was not cold, but rather the specific restraint of a man who had taught himself to be careful with things that mattered to him, which was not the same as not caring. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said that Catherine had been very young, and that she had been kind, and that he had believed for the first 18 months after her death that the failure of protection was entirely his to carry. He said this without looking at Cecily, which meant he was still learning how to say it. And she understood, because she was still learning how to receive it. She had not said that the failure was not his, because he would not have been ready to hear it yet. She had said, instead, that she thought courage was sometimes the thing one managed to do on the second attempt, when the first had been too costly. And he had turned to look at her with an expression that was not quite the one he wore in public, or the one he wore with his mother, or even the one he had worn beside the piano in December, but a new one, quieter and more open, that seemed to be specifically for her. The portrait of Catherine, Duchess of Ashmore, was facing outward the following morning, when Cecily walked through the gallery carrying her account books, and Edmund was standing before it with his hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak when she passed. She did not stop. She simply noted, as she went, that the woman in the portrait had dark eyes and a steady expression, and that the painter had caught something in the set of her mouth that looked very much like courage. On the last evening of February, snow still heavy on the grounds, and the sky gone dark early, and the fires in every room already lit, Cecily sat down at the piano in the east drawing-room and opened the lid and set her hands on the keys. The instrument was in tune now, because she had asked the tuner from the village to come and attend to it, which he had done on a Thursday morning with great thoroughness and a mild disapproval of whoever had left the instrument uncovered through a cold autumn. She played the Clementi sonatina through from the beginning, all 3 movements, because she knew all 3 now, having had access for the first time in her adult life to an instrument she could return to. Edmund came to the doorway. He did not stand at the threshold. He came in, and he sat in the chair beside the piano, the one where Henry had slept in December. And he listened with his hands on his knees and his face in the expression that was specifically for her. And the fire at the east end of the room kept its steady work. And outside the tall windows the snow fell without sound onto the grounds of Ashmore House. When the last chord settled, he said nothing. She lifted her hands from the keys and felt the quiet of the room hold around them both. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a thing resolved. A door that had been standing open and had now, of its own weight, gently closed, and she understood that she was home. The candle on the piano burned steadily in the windless room, and the snow kept falling. And that was enough. If Cecily's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that mattered most to you, and consider following along for the next one. There are more women like her, and they deserve to be heard.